What do you do when the road breaks beneath you, and the only man with a roof to spare looks as if he already knows what you're running from? The morning bell from Broken Creek's distant church tower chimed 6 times as Martha Cale stepped down from the stranded stage, her hat-box clutched tight against her ribs. The September air carried the scent of drying grass and the promise of early frost. Around her, the other passengers, a drummer with sample cases and an elderly minister bound for Cheyenne, stretched road-weary limbs and eyed the ranch buildings with varying degrees of hope and resignation. Axles cracked clean through, the driver announced, crawling out from beneath the coach. He wiped grease-black hands on his leather chaps. "Won't make Cheyenne today, nor tomorrow neither, less I can find a smithy." The tall rancher approached with an unhurried stride that spoke of a man comfortable with his land and the rhythm of its demands. His hair showed silver at the temples, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who'd spent years mending fence and gentling horses. "Name's Jacob Henley," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "This here's Broken Creek Ranch. You're welcome to shelter and a hot meal while Carlson tends his rig." Martha felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes upon her. The drummer calculating his lost sales, the minister preparing pastoral comfort, the driver counting costs. She'd grown accustomed to being the woman who needed help, the widow travelling on borrowed money with nowhere particular to land. The familiarity of it stung. "I'm Martha Cale," she said, finding her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I'm much obliged for the kindness." She paused, then added what had become her practised phrase, "I'm seeking work, if you know of any in these parts." Something shifted in Jacob Henley's expression, not pity, which she'd grown to recognize and despise, but a kind of thoughtful consideration. "Well now," he said, glancing toward the ranch house where smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, lonely line, "might be we could discuss that over breakfast. My cook took fever last week and headed back to her people. Been making do with beans and hardtack since." The minister cleared his throat. "Most Christian of you, Brother Henley, the Lord provides." "The Lord provides," Jacob agreed, but his eyes remained on Martha. "Question is whether we're smart enough to recognize what he's offering when it comes knocking at our gate." Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks. Inside her hat-box, beneath her marriage certificate and the few coins that remained of her widow's portion, lay a letter of reference from Mrs. Caldwell back in Kansas. It praised her cooking, her industry, her moral character, all the virtues expected of a woman seeking respectable employment. What it didn't mention was the way she'd stood in her kitchen the morning after the burial, looking at her husband's empty chair and feeling not grief but relief, so profound it frightened her. "I can cook and keep house," she said simply. "I worked alongside my husband on our place for 8 years before the consumption took him." Jacob nodded. "Breakfast first, then we'll talk terms." The ranch house stood 2 stories tall with a wide front porch that wrapped around the eastern side. The boards were weathered but sound, and someone had planted hollyhocks along the foundation that still showed late-season blooms. As they approached, Martha noticed the windows needed washing, and the porch rail could use mending, but the bones of the place were solid. It felt like a house that wanted tending, not charity. Inside, the main room held a fieldstone fireplace, large enough to roast a haunch of beef, flanked by built-in shelves that housed a surprising collection of books. A long table dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred by years of use but rubbed smooth by countless meals and meetings. Through an archway, Martha glimpsed a kitchen with a massive cast-iron stove and windows facing east to catch the morning light. "Coffee's on the stove," Jacob said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Afraid it's strong enough to float horseshoes, but it's hot." Martha set her hat-box on the table and moved toward the kitchen with the instinctive purposefulness of a woman who'd spent years feeding people. The coffee was indeed strong, but the stove was well maintained, and the kitchen, though dusty, showed signs of someone who understood the importance of good tools. Cast-iron skillets hung from hooks above the stove, their surfaces seasoned to black perfection. A row of mason jars lined one shelf, most empty now, but labeled in a careful hand: beans, flour, sugar, salt. "Your cook kept things organized," Martha observed, running her finger along the edge of a cutting board that bore the nicks and stains of long service. Maria worked for the previous owner, Jacob said, leaning against the doorframe. Stayed on when I bought the place 3 years back. Good woman, but her grandson took sick down in New Mexico. Family comes first. Martha found eggs in the pantry, smoked bacon in the shed, and enough flour for biscuits. Soon the kitchen filled with the sharp scent of frying meat and the steady heat of the iron stove. The familiar rhythm of cooking steadied her. For the first time in months she felt useful again. Through the window she saw Jacob directing the others toward the barn, his gestures efficient and sure. It had been a long time since she'd worked alongside a man who didn't need coaxing to act. By breakfast the room glowed with autumn light. The men ate hungrily, while Jacob watched her more than the food, weighing something in his mind. Afterward he led her onto the porch. He spoke plainly. He needed more than a cook, someone who could manage travelers as well as meals. She would have her own room, wages, and a share of the income. "I'm not looking for society," Martha said. "I'm looking for work." Jacob nodded, extending his hand. "Then we understand each other." Within days, Martha had settled into the rhythm scrubbing windows, organizing the pantry, serving suppers to passing wagon crews. The work was demanding, but it gave her purpose. When Jacob mentioned riding into town for more supplies, she asked to go along, and he agreed. The trail wound through crisp autumn air, aspens already tinged with gold. Martha rode a gentle bay mare and felt herself relax into the horse's gait. "You ride well," Jacob observed. "My husband taught me." She answered her first mention of William without the reflex of mourning. "You ride well," Jacob observed. As they crested a hill that offered a view of the town spread below them, a cluster of buildings arranged around a central street, with the church spire rising above the rest. "William taught me," Martha said, then paused. It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband without feeling the familiar weight of obligation to say something properly mournful. He said a woman on a ranch needed to be able to get places under her own power. Smart man. They rode in comfortable silence until they reached the edge of town. Broken Creek Township was larger than Martha had expected. 2 saloons, a hotel, a bank, and a mercantile that seemed to sell everything from farm tools to women's hats. People nodded to Jacob as they passed, and Martha caught more than one curious glance directed her way. At the mercantile, Martha fingered the blue calico while Jacob conducted business with the proprietor. The fabric was even prettier up close, with tiny white flowers scattered across the deep blue background. It would make a lovely dress for Sunday services, or for special occasions at the ranch. "That would suit you," said a voice behind her. Martha turned to find a woman about her own age, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes. "I'm Eleanor Henderson. My husband owns this place. Martha Cale. I'm working out at Broken Creek Ranch." "Yes, I'd heard." Eleanor's tone was neutral, neither disapproving nor welcoming. "How are you finding it?" "I like the work," Martha said honestly, "and Mr. Henley's been very fair in his dealings." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Jacob's a good man. Lost his wife to fever 4 years back, before he bought the ranch. Some folks thought he might remarry by now, but he's been particular about his privacy." She paused meaningfully. "Of course, having a woman working out there might change people's assumptions." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm his cook and housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, nothing more." "I'm sure you are, dear. But you know how people talk." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of someone who'd heard plenty of such talk. "I'm not judging, Lord knows. We all need to make our way in the world. Just thought you should know what you might be walking into." That evening, as Martha prepared dinner for a table of cowboys heading north with a small herd, she found herself thinking about Eleanor Henderson's warning. The blue calico lay folded in her room upstairs, still uncut. She'd bought it with her own money, earned through her own work, but Eleanor's words had planted a seed of doubt that grew with each passing hour. After the cowboys departed, she helped Jacob with the evening accounts, sitting across from him at the kitchen table as he tallied the day's receipts. The lamplight cast warm shadows across his face, highlighting the laugh lines around his eyes and the strong line of his jaw. He was a handsome man, she realized, not in the flashy way of the drummers who sometimes passed through, but with the solid attractiveness of someone comfortable in his own skin. "Something troubling you?" he asked. glancing up from his ledger. Martha hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned that people might talk. About me working here, I mean." Jacob set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Eleanor Henderson's a good woman, but she worries too much about what people think. What matters is that you're doing honest work for honest pay." He paused. "Are you concerned about your reputation?" "No," Martha said, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "I'm concerned about yours." For a long moment they sat in silence. Then Jacob smiled, the first truly warm smile she'd seen from him since her arrival. "Mrs. Cale, I stopped caring what the good people of Broken Creek thought about my choices the day I decided to buy this ranch, instead of the respectable cattle spread everyone expected me to purchase. This place suits me, and if it suits you too, then we'll let the gossips find someone else to talk about." As Martha climbed the stairs to her room that night, she felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the marriage certificate in her hat-box, and everything to do with the possibility that she might finally be building a life that belonged entirely to herself. On Sunday morning the church bell chimed 9 times as Martha stood in her room, studying the blue calico dress she'd finished sewing by lamplight the night before. The fabric had transformed into something lovely, simple but elegant, with a fitted bodice and skirt that moved gracefully when she walked. It was the first piece of clothing she'd made for herself in over a year, and the first that wasn't black. Through her window she could see Jacob in the corral, working with a young colt that shied away from the halter. His movements were patient and deliberate, never forcing but always persistent. There was something hypnotic about watching him work the way he seemed to understand the animal's fear, and respond with exactly the right combination of firmness and gentleness. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Cale?" Jacob's voice carried up from the hallway. "Stage coming in with passengers. Looks like we'll have company for dinner." Martha smoothed the blue dress one more time, then opened her door to find Jacob standing at the foot of the stairs. He wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair still damp from washing. When he saw her in the new dress, something shifted in his expression, a brief moment of surprise, followed by unmistakable approval. "You look lovely," he said simply, then cleared his throat. "The passengers include a woman traveling alone with 2 children. Thought you might want to know." As they walked toward the main room together, Martha caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the grief-worn widow who'd stepped off the stage a week ago. This woman stood straighter, moved with purpose, and wore colors that spoke of life rather than mourning. The arriving passengers proved to be a mixed group, the woman Jacob had mentioned, traveling with a boy of about 10 and a girl perhaps 6 years younger, plus a well-dressed gentleman who introduced himself as a territorial surveyor and a grizzled prospector heading for the gold camps. As Martha helped serve dinner, she found herself drawn to the woman, who had the careful composure of someone managing fear beneath a calm surface. "I'm Sarah Whitman," the woman said as Martha refilled her coffee cup. "These are my children, Thomas and Lucy. We're traveling to Denver to join my brother." There was something in Sarah's tone that suggested the journey wasn't entirely voluntary, and Martha noticed the way the woman's eyes darted toward the windows whenever a horse passed on the road outside. She'd seen that look before in the mirror, during the last months of her marriage, when William's illness had made him unpredictable and sometimes cruel. After dinner, while Jacob discussed routes and conditions with the surveyor, Martha found herself sitting on the porch with Sarah and the children. Little Lucy had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, while Thomas whittled a piece of wood with the absorbed concentration of a boy trying to appear older than his years. "You have a peaceful place here," Sarah said quietly. "I can see why you'd want to stay." "It wasn't always peaceful," Martha found herself saying. "Sometimes we have to travel a long way to find where we belong." Sarah's eyes met hers with sudden understanding. "Yes," she said simply. "Sometimes we do." That evening, as Martha prepared the guest rooms and saw to the traveller's needs, she realized something had shifted inside her chest. The careful walls she'd built around her heart during the long months of her marriage and the longer months of widowhood had begun to crack, letting in light she'd forgotten existed. When Jacob appeared at her elbow to help carry extra blankets upstairs, the brush of his hand against hers sent warmth through her entire body. "The Whitman woman seems troubled," he said quietly, as they arranged bedding in the second guest-room. "I think she's running from something," Martha replied. "Or someone." Jacob nodded grimly. "I've seen it before. Women travelling alone with children, paying cash and asking too many questions about who might come looking for them." He paused, smoothing a quilt across the bed with careful precision. "We don't ask questions here, but we keep our eyes open." The simple statement, "we keep our eyes open," made Martha's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to belonging. For the first time since William's death, she wasn't facing the world alone. Later that night, as she sat in her room brushing her hair by lamplight, Martha caught herself humming a soft, wordless melody she hadn't thought of in years. The blue dress hung from a peg on the wall, ready for morning, and through her window she could see the corral where Jacob had worked with the colt earlier. The young horse stood quiet now, no longer fighting the halter, and Martha wondered if there was something to be said for the kind of patience that allowed trust to grow slowly, naturally, without force. In her hat-box the marriage certificate lay undisturbed, but for the first time since packing it, Martha felt no compulsion to unfold it, and read the words that had once defined her entire existence. Tomorrow would bring new travelers, new challenges, new opportunities to build the life she was discovering she wanted. Tonight, that was enough. The church bell had just finished chiming 8 on Tuesday morning when Martha looked up from her biscuit dough to see dust rising from the eastern road. Through the kitchen window she watched 3 riders approach the ranch at a pace that spoke of urgency rather than leisure travel. Something in their bearing, straight-backed and purposeful, made her pulse quicken with unease. Jacob emerged from the barn and walked to meet them, his movements unhurried but alert. Martha couldn't hear the conversation from the kitchen, but she could see the lead rider gesturing toward the house, while Jacob shook his head, his arms crossed over his chest. After several minutes, the riders wheeled their horses and departed as abruptly as they'd arrived. "Who were they?" Martha asked when Jacob entered the kitchen, his expression carefully neutral. "Men looking for someone," he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "Woman traveling with 2 children. Claimed they were hired to bring her back to her husband in Kansas." Martha's hands stilled in the bread dough. "Sarah Whitman?" That was the name they mentioned. Jacob's voice was quiet, but Martha could hear the steel underneath. "I told them I couldn't help them. Lot of folks pass through here, hard to keep track of everyone." Through the window, Martha could see the Whitman children playing near the corral while their mother hung washing on the line behind the house. They'd been at the ranch for 3 days now, and Martha had noticed how Sarah's shoulders had gradually relaxed, how the constant watchfulness had begun to fade from her eyes. Now it would return, sharper than before. "They'll be back," Martha said, shaping the dough into loaves with more force than necessary. "Maybe. Maybe not." Jacob leaned against the doorframe, studying her face. "You seem to know something about running from men who think they own you." The words hit Martha like cold water. She'd been careful never to speak directly about her marriage, but Jacob was more observant than she'd given him credit for. "Some men believe ownership comes with wedding vows," she said finally. "And some women discover they're stronger than they knew once they get free of such men." That afternoon, while Jacob rode the boundary fences, Martha found Sarah in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds with the mechanical intensity of someone trying to outwork her anxiety. The children had gone exploring along the creek, with strict instructions not to wander far. "There were men here this morning," Martha said without preamble. "Looking for you." Sarah's hands went still among the bean plants. "How many?" 3. "Jacob sent them away, but they'll likely return." For a long moment Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the mountains rising beyond the ranch boundaries. "I left my husband 3 weeks ago," she said finally. "Took the children and what money I could gather. He's a prominent man in Lawrence, owns the grain elevator and sits on the town council. People think he's respectable. But he's not." "He hasn't hit the children yet," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. "But Thomas is getting older, starting to stand up to him. And Lucy." She swallowed hard. "Lucy flinches when any man raises his voice." "She's 6 years old, Martha. 6." Martha thought of her own marriage, of the way William's illness had stripped away his veneer of kindness to reveal something ugly underneath. She'd endured it because she'd believed she had no choice, but Sarah had found the courage to run. "Where will you go?" Martha asked. "My brother in Denver, if I can reach him. He's never liked Harold, my husband. He'll help us start over." Sarah looked up at Martha with eyes that held equal measures of hope and desperation. "I just need a few more days to rest the children and plan our route." That evening Martha served dinner to a table that included the Whitmans and 2 traveling preachers heading for a revival meeting in Cheyenne. The conversation was pleasant enough talk of weather and crops and the upcoming harvest, but Martha noticed how Sarah kept glancing toward the windows, how her hand trembled slightly when she reached for her water glass. After the meal, as Martha cleaned the kitchen, she found herself thinking about the folded marriage certificate in her hat box upstairs. For 8 years that piece of paper had defined her world, bound her to a man who'd grown increasingly bitter and controlling as his illness progressed. She'd honored those vows until death parted them, but she'd learned the difference between legal obligation and moral duty. Jacob appeared in the doorway, carrying the last of the dinner plates. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, setting them by the wash-basin. "I was thinking about promises," Martha said, scrubbing a stubborn spot of gravy from a plate. "How some are worth keeping and others aren't." "The Whitman situation?" Martha nodded. "If those men come back—" "They won't find what they're looking for," Jacob said firmly. "This ranch doesn't harbor fugitives, but it doesn't turn away people in need of help either." The next morning brought a late-season thunderstorm that rattled the windows and turned the ranch yard into a muddy bog. Martha was grateful for the weather. It would slow any pursuit and give Sarah more time to decide on her next move. She spent the morning baking bread and preparing a large pot of stew, the kind of meal that would satisfy both travelers and the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. Around midday, as the storm began to clear, she heard horses in the yard again. Through the kitchen window she saw the same 3 riders from before, their oilskin coats dripping with rain. This time they didn't bother with conversation. The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a badge pinned to his coat, dismounted and walked directly toward the house. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the main room, where Jacob was already standing by the fireplace, his rifle propped casually against the mantel within easy reach. "Sheriff's business," the man announced as he pushed through the door without knocking. "We have a warrant for the return of Sarah Whitman and her children to the custody of her lawful husband in Kansas." "Let me see it," Jacob said calmly. The man produced a folded paper from his coat. Jacob examined it carefully, then handed it back with a slight shake of his head. "This is a Kansas warrant. You're in Wyoming territory now, Sheriff. Your jurisdiction ended about 200 miles back." "We have an agreement with the territorial authorities," the sheriff said, his voice rising slightly. "Fugitive wives are still fugitives, and I mean to collect the bounty on this one." Bounty. The word hit Martha like a physical blow. She thought of Sarah's quiet courage, of little Lucy's shy smile, of Thomas's determined effort to be the man of the family. They weren't fugitives. They were a mother and children seeking safety. "There's no one here by that name," Martha said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "We get a lot of travelers, but I keep careful records of our guests." The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "You'd be the widow woman, then, Martha Cale." The way he said her name made her skin crawl. He'd done his research, knew exactly who lived at the ranch and what her circumstances were. "I'm Mrs. Cale, yes. Heard you had some trouble with the law yourself back in Kansas. Something about disputed property after your husband passed?" Martha felt the blood drain from her face. There had been no trouble with the law. William's cousin had contested the will, claimed Martha had coerced her dying husband into leaving her the farm. The case had been dismissed, but the accusation had followed her across 3 states. "That's enough," Jacob said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "You've seen there's no one here who matches your description. I suggest you move along before this weather gets worse." The sheriff smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll be back tomorrow with territorial authority, and next time we'll search every building on this property." He tipped his hat mockingly toward Martha. "Pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Cale. Hope you're more cooperative tomorrow." After the men departed, Martha sank into a chair by the fireplace, her legs suddenly unsteady. Jacob poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept on the mantel, and handed one to her without comment. "They know she's here," Martha said, after taking a sip that burned her throat. "Yes, and they know about me, about Kansas." Jacob nodded grimly. "Men like that make it their business to know things. Gives them leverage." Martha thought about the marriage certificate upstairs, about the life she'd left behind, about the courage it had taken for Sarah to run. Then she thought about Lucy's frightened eyes and Thomas's fierce protectiveness of his mother and sister. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Jacob set down his whiskey and walked to the window, studying the muddy yard and the road beyond. When he turned back to face her, his expression was resolute. "We're going to give them a choice," he said. "Stay and fight, or disappear so completely that even bloodhounds couldn't track them." That evening, as Martha prepared what might be the Whitman family's last meal at the ranch, she realized that some decisions change everything that comes after. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't predict, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. Act 3. The church bell was chiming 6 times when Martha stepped into the pre-dawn darkness, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. She'd slept little, listening to the sounds of preparation that had continued throughout the night. Horses being saddled, supplies loaded, quiet conversations held in corners. Now, as she walked toward the barn where Jacob waited with 3 saddled horses, she felt the familiar weight of her hat-box tucked under her arm. "They'll be here within the hour," Jacob said, checking the cinch on a sturdy bay gelding. "You're sure about this?" Martha nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The plan was simple in conception, dangerous in execution. Sarah and the children would take the back trail toward the mining camp at Silver Creek, where Jacob's friend Tom Brennan would hide them until they could safely continue to Denver. Meanwhile, Martha would remain at the ranch to face the sheriff's return and provide a different kind of distraction. "The stage from Cheyenne is due at 8, she said, reviewing the timing once more. "That should give them enough witnesses." From the shadows near the corral, Sarah Whitman emerged, leading her children by the hand. She dressed them in their warmest clothes and carried everything they owned in 2 small bundles tied with rope. In the lamplight, her face looked carved from stone, but Martha could see the tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to," Martha replied, then knelt to embrace little Lucy, who clung to her neck with surprising strength. "Be brave, sweetheart. Your mamma's going to take you somewhere wonderful." Thomas stepped forward, his young face serious beyond his years. "Will you be in trouble because of us?" Martha thought of the marriage certificate in her hat-box, of the life she'd built at the ranch over the past 2 weeks, of the choice that lay ahead of her. "Sometimes being in the right kind of trouble is better than being safe in the wrong place," she said, ruffling his hair. As the Whitmans mounted their horses and disappeared into the pre-dawn gloom, Martha walked back toward the house with Jacob beside her. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the rumble of approaching hoofbeats. "You could still leave with them," Jacob said quietly. "Take the north trail and be in Silver Creek by noon." Martha stopped walking and turned to face him. In the growing light she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was set with determination. This man was willing to face down 3 armed bounty hunters to protect people he barely knew, and he was offering her an escape route because he understood what it meant to run from a past that wouldn't let go. "I'm not running anymore," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "This is my home now." Jacob's expression shifted, and for a moment Martha thought he might reach for her hand. Instead he nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of a promise. "Then we stand together." The sheriff and his men arrived just as the church bell chimed 7, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth of the ranch yard. This time they'd brought a 4th man, someone in a territorial marshal's coat, who dismounted with the authority of federal law behind him. Martha stood on the front porch beside Jacob, her hat-box clutched in both hands. She dressed carefully in her blue calico dress, pinned her hair up in a style that spoke of respectability and determination. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine whether she remained Martha Cale, cook, and housekeeper of Broken Creek Ranch, or became once again the frightened widow who'd stepped off the stage 2 weeks ago. "Marshal Davidson," Jacob said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sheriff, gentlemen." The marshal was a lean man, with grey eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. "Mr. Henley, we have proper authorization now to search these premises for Sarah Whitman and her children. I trust you cooperate fully." "Of course," Jacob replied. "Though I should mention we're expecting the morning stage within the hour. Wouldn't want to alarm the passengers unnecessarily." The marshal's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "We'll be as discreet as possible. Sheriff Mullins, take the barn and outbuildings. Stevens, check the bunkhouse. I'll search the main house." As the men spread out across the ranch, Martha found herself walking beside the marshal toward the front door. Her hands were steady now, her breathing calm. She'd made her choice, and there was something liberating about moving beyond the reach of fear. "You're Mrs. Martha Cale," the marshal said as they entered the main room. "It wasn't a question." "I am. I understand you've had some difficulties with legal matters back in Kansas." Martha set her hat box on the dining table and turned to face him directly. "My husband's cousin contested his will. The court found no merit in his claims and dismissed the case. If that's what you're referring to, still it shows a pattern of behavior. Disputed inheritances, flight from Kansas, harboring fugitives. The marshal let the implications hang in the air. "I came to Wyoming Territory seeking honest work," Martha said. "I found it at this ranch. There's no pattern except a woman trying to build a decent life for herself." From outside came the sound of doors slamming, boots on wooden floors, men conducting a thorough search. Martha knew they would find nothing, Sarah, and the children were miles away by now, following game trails that wouldn't show wheel ruts or obvious signs of passage, but she also knew that wouldn't be the end of it. "May I ask what's in the box?" the marshal said, nodding toward her hat box. Martha's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice level. "Personal effects, papers, and such." "I'd like to see them." For a moment Martha hesitated. Then she opened the box and withdrew the folded marriage certificate, yellowed with age and creased from years of handling. She handed it to the marshal without comment. He unfolded it carefully, reading the formal language that had bound her to William Cale for 8 years of increasingly difficult marriage. When he looked up, his expression was thoughtful. "This document shows you were legally married," he said. "It doesn't show why you left Kansas, or what your relationship might be to the fugitive woman we're seeking." "I left Kansas because my husband died, and I had nothing left there," Martha said. "I don't know any Sarah Whitman. I keep careful records of our guests, and no one by that name has stayed at this ranch." It was true, in a way. The woman who'd registered in Martha's careful guest ledger had signed herself as Mrs. S. White, with 2 children, a widow traveling to visit family, she'd claimed. Martha had asked no questions and recorded exactly what she'd been told. The marshal studied the marriage certificate for another long moment, then refolded it and handed it back. "You understand that harboring fugitives is a federal crime, Mrs. Cale. The penalties are severe." "I understand that this ranch provides meals and shelter to travelers," Martha replied. "We don't interrogate our guests about their personal affairs." From outside came the sound of horses, approaching at speed the morning stage from Cheyenne, right on schedule. Through the window, Martha could see the coach lurching to a stop in a cloud of dust, its driver calling out greetings to Jacob. Passengers began to emerge. A well-dressed woman with a small child, 2 businessmen in traveling clothes, and Martha's heart leaped the territorial circuit judge she'd served dinner to just a week before. "Judge Morrison," she heard Jacob call out. "Welcome back to Broken Creek Ranch." The marshal's jaw tightened as he recognized the implications. Whatever he'd planned to do, arrest Martha, threaten her, search her belongings more thoroughly, would now have to be conducted in front of witnesses that included a territorial judge. "Mrs. Cale," Judge Morrison said as he entered the main room, removing his hat and nodding politely to the marshal. "I was hoping to find you here. My wife asked me to compliment your apple pie, best she's tasted since leaving Missouri." "You're very kind, Judge Morrison," Martha replied, finding her voice steady despite the thunder of her pulse. I have a fresh one cooling in the kitchen, if you'd care for a slice with your coffee." "I believe I would." The judge glanced at the marshal with mild curiosity. "Official business, Marshal Davidson?" "Routine investigation," the marshal replied tersely. "Nothing that need concern you." But Judge Morrison was a man accustomed to reading situations, and Martha could see his sharp eyes taking in the tension in the room, the way the marshal's hand rested near his weapon, the other lawmen conducting their search outside. "I see. Well, I hope it concludes satisfactorily for all involved." The next few minutes passed in a blur of careful politeness. Martha served coffee and pie to the stage passengers while the marshal's men completed their fruitless search. Sheriff Mullins returned from the barn shaking his head. Stevens emerged from the bunkhouse empty-handed. Through it all, Judge Morrison maintained a steady stream of pleasant conversation about the weather, the condition of the roads, and his satisfaction with the accommodations at Broken Creek Ranch. Finally, Marshal Davidson gathered his men and approached Jacob and Martha on the front porch. "We found no evidence of the fugitives we're seeking," he said formally. "But I want to be clear. If we discover that anyone at this ranch provided aid or comfort to criminals fleeing justice, there will be consequences." "I understand your position, Marshal," Jacob replied. "I hope you understand mine. This ranch serves all manner of travelers, and we pride ourselves on providing a safe haven for anyone in need of rest and shelter." The marshal mounted his horse and looked down at Martha one final time. "Mrs. Cale, I suggest you be very careful about the choices you make going forward. Your past may be behind you, but your future depends on staying within the law." "Thank you for the advice, Marshal," Martha said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'll keep it in mind." As the lawmen rode away, Martha felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with relief, and everything to do with recognition. She'd faced down armed men and federal authority, lied to a marshal's face, and helped a desperate woman escape her abuser. More importantly, she'd done it all while standing beside someone who trusted her judgment and supported her choices. "Well," Judge Morrison said, stepping onto the porch with his coffee cup in hand, "that was quite a bit of excitement for a Tuesday morning." "We do our best to keep things interesting," Jacob replied with a slight smile. The judge chuckled and turned to Martha. "Mrs. Cale, I hope you'll consider this an official invitation to cater the territorial courthouse dedication next month. We'll pay well for someone who can handle a crowd and keep her composure under pressure." "I'd be honored, Judge Morrison," Martha said, and meant it. As the stage passengers settled in for their meal and the tension of the morning began to fade, Martha found herself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Jacob direct the unloading of supplies from the coach. In her hands she held the marriage certificate not clutched defensively, but held lightly, like something she was considering. That evening, after the stage had departed and the ranch had settled into its familiar rhythm of evening chores, Martha walked down to the creek that gave the ranch its name. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, catching the last light of the day. She could hear Jacob in the corral, working with the young colt that was finally learning to trust the halter. She unfolded the marriage certificate one last time, reading the faded words that had once seemed so important. Then, without ceremony, she tore it in half, then in quarters, then into pieces too small to read. The paper fluttered into the creek like yellowed snow, and the current carried it away toward whatever lay downstream. When she turned back toward the house, Jacob was standing at the edge of the corral watching her. In the twilight, his expression was unreadable, but something in his posture suggested he understood exactly what he'd witnessed. "Ready for supper?" he called out. "More than ready," Martha replied, walking toward him across ground that felt solid beneath her feet. For the first time since she could remember, tomorrow felt like a beginning rather than a continuation of something she'd rather leave behind. As they walked toward the house together, Martha realized she was humming again the same wordless melody that had surprised her weeks ago, but stronger now, more certain. Through the windows of the ranch house, warm light spilled onto the porch, where 2 chairs waited for evening conversations and the comfortable silence of people who'd found their place in the world. 3 days later, a letter arrived with the regular mail, addressed to Martha in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, on good paper that spoke of prosperity and hope, Sarah Whitman had written just 4 lines. "We reached Denver safely. My brother sends his gratitude. The children ask about you daily. Your courage gave us a new life." Martha folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box where she kept the ranch's receipts and records. Then she tied on her apron and began preparing dinner for the travelers who would arrive with the evening stage. Outside she could hear Jacob's voice calling to the horses, and beyond that the sound of the creek running clear and constant toward whatever lay ahead. The gate to Broken Creek Ranch hung straight and true on its hinges now, opened wide to welcome whoever might have need of shelter, and Martha Cale, cook and keeper of this place, stood ready to receive them all. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.